I'm Toussaint Morrison. I'm with Onsite Public Media, and today we are interviewing Jasmine, who is a teacher here in Minnesota, correct?
Yes.
All right. So what we're here today to talk about is literacy and kind of the entire scope of it that is basically entailed in school and education. What has been your experience with literacy, and how did you get into teaching? Like, what was your entrance and introduction to it?
So I'd say I actually started with a mom. I was helping her homeschool. She was in a group that I was also in, and she was like, I want help with my kids in math and science. And at the time I was in college, so I was just like, an extra side gig. And it started, I just did it for extra money, but then I found that I really actually enjoyed it. And so that's kind of how I started to think about teaching. Growing up, a lot of people told me that I would be a good teacher, but I never thought about it just because everyone says like teachers make no money and like all of that. And growing up poor, I'm not trying to be poor for the rest of my life. But it worked out. And so that's really where it started, was seeing them, third and fifth grader, seeing the really young ages and knowing that they were successful at reading, knowing how I felt about reading growing up. And then that kind of, that's really where my relationship with literacy started, was because reading was easy for me and I enjoyed it. So I wanted kids to have that same opportunity.
And you tell a story about your grandfather, I believe, in your blog, about him learning to read and how that was a milestone for you. Can you just tell us a little bit about that and why that was important to you? Yeah,
so my family originally comes from Mississippi, in very rural Mississippi. And my grandfather, growing up back then, pretty much you went to school as much as you needed just to get some basic math. But it wasn't as much focused on, like reading for joy or reading for learning. It was like, you got to read a basic contract, sign your name. And so he stopped going to school after the third grade, pretty much. And so by that time, it's like, you just learned the basics, but he always wanted to be able to read because he wanted to read the Bible. A very religious man, very close to God in that way. And so, as he got older, he saw all of his kids graduate from high school when he didn't. My grandmother also didn't. And I think that was it was important for him to finish because it's something that he wanted to do so that he could read the Bible, and he taught himself to read with it. And so that's the legacy that I come from, is refusing to say my life was hard or I didn't learn so I can't learn. And he was in his late 30s when he learned to read, and then he finished his high school degree about 6 years after that. So
Wow. Okay, Grandpa. That's an inspiring story. I mean, that you can't help but smile when you listen to that. That's amazing. How does that? I mean, the question is kind of already answers itself, but how has that influenced you as an English teacher moving forward?
I mean, knowing that that's the legacy that I came from, that's the history of my family, and also thinking about the students that I teach, and it might be a similar story for them. If their parents didn't finish high school, or if their parents maybe don't speak English as well as they do, they want more for their children than they had themselves. And that's been my family's story. So I want to make sure that whoever I'm teaching, they can continue on whatever legacy they want to have. And if you can't read, or if you really struggle to read, it really breaks a lot of barriers. And you're dependent on everyone else to do things for you. And so a solid foundation in literacy is a key to being able to free yourself and be free and make your own choices. And that's really how it influences when I work with students.
Absolutely. And working in Minnesota, I mean, we have some of the highest racial disparity in education. Do you see that in your classrooms, and how do you address it, and how does that make you feel going forward as a teacher? Yeah,
I mean, it's the racial disparity. I know that people have their feelings about standardized tests or whatever, but when I compare when I was in a school in South Minneapolis, in a more affluent neighborhood, to the one that I worked at last year, or the one I'm going to be working at this year, those disparities are apparent. And it's not because Black kids can't learn or because they're incapable. It's just because they haven't been taught. And I think that there's also I call it a belief gap. I don't think that the teachers that maybe work in these schools have the tools to be able to make up any of those gaps, so they start to turn it on to the families or say it's the student's fault. And so in my classroom, I tell my students, I'm like, this might be hard for you, but this is what I'm going to do so that it's a little bit easier. And I tell them every single step of the way. It's like, I know that this is hard, and that's why I'm doing this. I'm like, you have to trust me, especially with high school. By that time, they pretty much get to a point where they're like, I'm done with school. I've failed for this long. Like, this isn't for me. Like, you know, forget your class. And I'm like, I know that this is how most people treat you. I'm like, if I can be the one teacher that actually believes in you, I'm like, I just need you to get me 5%, and I'll show you why you can trust me.
Got you. And do you feel like, I guess this would just be negligent for me to not bring it up, but like when I was in school, like there was a certain trust between, you know, teachers of color versus white teachers. Do you feel that that sometimes works to your advantage, being a person of color addressing kids of color?
Of course. I mean, especially because I'm from a very similar background to the students that I teach.
Yeah.
So I tell them, like, I'm from the north side. Like, this is the type of family that I grew up in. Like, I've moved 28 times because of financial issues. Like, I'm really open about that. And then I tell them, I'm like, it's not, you know, a death sentence for the rest of your life. It's just a potential barrier. And if we do these things, you at least get the option to change that for you. And I think because I'm honest about where I'm from, and I'm, you know, it's just like, I was you.
Yeah.
And you can be whoever you want to be because I had that option. I had that choice.
Yeah. And I think a lot of kids, I mean, from when I worked as a paraprofessional, the immediate assumption is, oh, you're here to control me, huh? Like, you're here to change my narrative. All right, let me show you what that looks like. And so you end up getting a different situation than intended. In your blog, you wrote that there's a second-class citizenship being created through literacy, and an entire generation of children is not being taught to read. I want to get to the source of who is accountable for the not. Because I know immediately we want to go to teachers. And then I talk to teachers and they want to go to the system. And then when you even look at, you know, school boards and systems, they even say, well, we just don't have the budget. From your experience, where does the accountability lie, and where do we need to start that change so we're not creating an entire generation of children that can't read?
Well, where the change needs to happen is, I think that it only works if we get individual teachers, because big systems do resist change. And the thing is, I know teachers like to think of themselves apart from the system, but we work in one. So we are a part of it, and it's up to us to change the trajectory of that. And so understanding that when you're teaching a young kid to read, that they need to learn the sounds, that doesn't really require any money and a budget. There's enough stuff out there that you can figure it out for yourself. But what ends up happening is, I'll call it teacher prep. They'll tell you, like, all you need to do is surround yourself with good books. Or the biggest thing that prevents older kids from reading is that they don't have books that look like them. So then when we go into the classroom and we have kids that struggle to read, we're like, okay, of course. Like, a black kid from the hood needs to read about other black kids from the hood. And like, that's going to make them read, without us understanding that it's probably a fluency issue. Or maybe there's lagging phonemic awareness or vocabulary. And so it is on us as teachers because we are in the classroom, but every single person who's interacting or putting us in this position, we're all accountable for the students that we teach.
What's phonemic awareness?
Knowing how words sound, like the, ch, sh, things like that.
Do you ever think that and this is kind of like off of the questions I had, but like the onus should or could be on said teacher that may not have the phonemic awareness of the kind of the colloquialisms that, you know, some of the students come from, you know, like, in a sense, how do I say?
Like, they don't know African American English?
Sure, that. Or basically attempting to normalize what they don't understand and bring it into their culture and be like, I have to correct you. You know, whereas maybe it should be them understanding said student and then, you know, collaborating. I mean, does that seem like a solution, or does the phonemic awareness need to lie on the student, or does it have to lie on the teacher as well, I guess?
Well, we're programmed to talk, like we just pick it up, but we're not programmed to read in the same way.
Got it.
So we can't just like look at a word and then, like the word cat. If you're not taught that k-a-t, just like, you're not just going to be able to look at the word and then just know what it is. And so what we'll often do, unfortunately, is we'll put a picture, and then we'll say, this word is cat, instead of teaching kids, like, C represents the K sound,
Got
A
it.
represents an A sound, as well as some others.
Uh-huh.
And so I don't think that like creating definitions of sounds with students is the best way to teach that.
Got it.
It's better to just say, this is what these represent, let's practice, and then get them to reading as fast as we can.
Yeah, you mentioned African American English, and I think I just want to point that out, that there seems to be a disparity sometimes in language between teachers and students, especially, you know, when I was growing up, you know, the words that we used were not the words that our teachers used. And they were not the words that the Hmong kids used or the Latinx kids used. Is it a teacher's responsibility to kind of lock into those colloquialisms and that, the language of the students, or is it the other way around?
Absolutely. I mean, you're the person, as a teacher, you're the person that has the power in the classroom because you're the adult, you went to school, you have certain knowledge that the students don't. And so it's not up to the kids to tell you like, hey, these are things in my culture, you should know the students that you're teaching. And if you're not from that culture, then you should be, that's part of your work too, is to understand these are how the cultures work. This is the culture of school or mainstream America, you know, for all of the positives and the negatives that go along with mainstream, whatever you want to call it. But if we don't teach those things, if we don't teach them that the is TH, you know, then it's really shutting them out from certain opportunities.
Absolutely. So in 2017, the National Assessment of Educational Progress said 60% of children nationwide are not reading proficiently. And what does that say to you in terms of systems and teachers? Is this willful negligence, or is this, well, I don't know how to do this, you know, misinformed negligence?
It can be a combination of both.
Yeah.
There are definitely teachers, we've all had them, and we know that they're just there to kind of finish their job and then to get their pension. I mean, hopefully those teachers are far and few between. But then a lot of teachers just don't know. The National Council for Teacher Quality put out a recent study of a survey of what colleges of education are teaching their teachers about the science of reading, and it's still less than half. Less than half of all programs are teaching the basics of how reading works.
Wow.
So 50% aren't at all, and then 50% are doing some.
Okay.
So it is a combination of not knowing, but then also maybe you just don't care.
Okay, and how do we turn that around?
Yeah.
Can you solve all our problems right now, Jess?
No, I don't think that the answer lies in hoping that all of the schools of education change what they do. We can continue to apply the pressure, continue to call this out, but when it comes down to it, it's the teacher in the classroom.
Okay.
And so the professional development that we have in schools, the type of research that's brought into our schools, the type of seminars that we're sent to, those need to be focused on teaching teachers how to teach, equipping us with the pedagogical tools to, you know, boost achievement rather than a lot of what we get, which is, you know, a trauma-informed training where the instructor shows you a video of a kid punching through a glass window and then tells you that it was the teacher's fault. Because, that's what I experienced last year.
Is that a real video?
Yes.
What?
It was like a level 4 setting with a child with an emotional disturbance, and the teacher and him had an altercation. The kid punched through a window, and the instructor said to us, the person leading the session said, "What do you notice?" And then she told us that the kid punched through the glass window because the teacher riled him up, and it was the teacher's fault because he was impressing middle class values. So that's what teachers are learning.
Okay.
Yes.
And what about that needs to change? What about that is problematic?
To expect someone to be calm is not a middle class thing. I think that everyone can sit here and have a conversation regardless of what they look like. But again, like it's a district issue too. Yeah. They don't know, we don't know. There's just so much misinformation about what goes into teaching and how learning works. Yeah. And it starts with colleges of education, but they're only with us for a year. So it really, at the school level, is really where I think that the change can happen. And Eric Colenz is a Minneapolis author, and he wrote an entire book about this. Like, oftentimes what happens is education attacks the wrong issue. They think that kids aren't reading because it's a behavior issue, or they think that kids aren't reading because it's something at home. instead of realizing like maybe they just weren't taught how to sound things out.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would that go into the quote you had from your blog, failed by Shoddy Science in the name of education?
Yes.
And the Shoddy Science is
like 3Qing. This is initial reading acquisition. So it's like saying you can have a lot of different strategies to sound out a word. You can say the first letter and then see if it makes sense. Or, instead of, if you can't sound it out, just look at the picture up top and see what word makes sense in the sentence. Rather than, here is C-A-T. The C sound here makes a K, the A makes an A, the T makes a T. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's like, well, we didn't get to that letter, so I'm gonna have them guess. And that's the Shoddy Science. And it gets kids into a pattern of relying on pictures instead of looking at the words. And I see that in my high school students. They'll get to certain words and they'll see the first letters and guess at the rest of it.
Okay. And we'll get to your famous quote right now, as we were speaking about earlier. You say literacy is the forgotten social justice issue of our time. Tell me more about that, and how did you come to that phrase?
So I wrote that article just like I don't remember, it was this time last year, and I was just like really, really riled up about something. I don't remember what.
It's only a year old?
Yeah.
Oh, this is going to be with you for a long time. I thought you were like, oh, it's been around for so long. I was like, oh man, she must have wrote that like 10 years ago.
No.
Like 5 years ago. No, just a year.
But it was just like everything that I had been feeling, and I felt like dismissed because I wasn't talking about, I'm a progressive educator. I mean, in all the ways you want to think about, I am very progressive, but somehow teaching children phonics is associated with conservatism, and I'm just pushing back on that. And it's
How
like,
is that associated with?
I have no idea. It
Okay.
is. It's like because I'm the teacher and I'm telling them what to do. So that's like a conservative thing, and I just push back on that. And I'm just like, you know what? I'm like, you can say, get our cops out of schools. I'll be with you on that. You can say that we need smaller class sizes. I'll totally be with you on that. But when I say, hey, half of the children in my class cannot read, and you say it's because they're poor, I do have a problem with that.
Yeah.
So you can't at one point say Black Lives Matter and then not look at what those black kids are also learning. Like as a teacher, that's my job, is to teach.
Yeah.
And so if they're not reading, how can they do well in my class?
Yeah.
And so it shouldn't be forgotten. It should be the primary thing. If you leave school, one thing you should be able to do is to read. And there are a lot of kids that can't, that are graduating, that really struggle to read.
Do you ever feel like, damn, that bar is low? We're having a conversation about reading.
Yep. All the time.
Because it just hit me, and I'm just like, damn, we talk about reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's just like, you're telling me that there are kids graduating from high school that cannot sound out words, and I'm saying yes.
We should be past that.
We
obviously.
should. But, all the other things that are easier to target. We need books with brown kids. Of course we do. But they can't read the words in the books with the brown kid.
So what does it matter if you have a book with the brown kid if the brown kid can't read the book?
But all those other things, graduation rates, brown kids in books, low-hanging fruit, easier to do, easier to change than to say, you need to learn all the phonemes in the English language and then have kids practice them until they can blend them in a word.
Okay, so then this kind of rounds out the questions for this. If the bar is low and we're just talking about reading, systematically what is failing us right now? Because we talked about teachers and having to be kind of like, the in charge of their own classrooms and the culture in the classroom as well. What systemically needs to change? Or just a starter, like you don't got to tell us, like on the 10th floor, like what needs to change, like just the integrity of this institution of education.
It needs to be based on the science of how we learn, on cognitive science, what we've learned from that field, rather than feelings and philosophies about what education should be. And
to localize this very quickly, for Minnesota and the racial disparity, because we're talking about reading, we're talking about one of the leading states that has failed black children, children of color across the board, sweepingly across the board, especially black children and Native American children. Why is this happening here, especially in a state that prides itself on being progressive, being ahead in education, which seems to be something that has only been available to white students and accessible to white students? Why is that disparity happening here?
I think that, well, racism in the North, I think people like to think that it doesn't really exist. Just like, you know what I mean? And
Except for
it's
the
just
black people in the North.
except for the black people in
what
the
y'all talking
North.
about?
And so it's just like, well, there was never slavery here. There was never like redlining, right? And it's like, no, that happened here. And I think that there's kind of these blinders on. And then again, I think it all comes back to how the teacher sees their role. Like if I want to be a teacher that works in a Title I school, meaning that there's a very high population of free and reduced lunch, is it because I want them to have a great education, or is it because I want to see myself as a savior or a martyr? And I think that that also comes into it, and especially with the like white liberals who don't know anything about African American culture or like the ideas, the legacy that we come from, where my grandfather was 42 and went back to high school. You know what I mean? Like, I think that they malign those kinds of things. And so there's just a mismatch between what the overwhelmingly white teaching force believes that kids like me need and what my community actually says.
And it's also, I think people forget that it was illegal for black people to read.
Yep.
At a certain point. So
it was illegal for my grandfather to learn to read. So
I was going to ask that in the beginning. I didn't know how long ago it was, but if your grandfather, we come from a lineage that was, it was criminalized to read. So.
And now we're not teaching children to read.
Well, imagine that.
Full circle.
This history going full circle. So we'll round up with this. What in your work, what do you plan on doing to break that cycle?
So outside of my actual classroom, a lot of what I do is focused on just like raising the alarm. In the circles that I run in education, it's really, really focused on like, okay, we're not teaching like the 8-year-olds all of the sounds that make up words. But the people will say like, well, they'll pick it up later. And then I'm really, really pushing back and I'm saying, I have 10th graders that I can see were taught with the methods that you're saying are okay, and they're struggling to read still. So me as the high school English teacher, I should be able to just teach literature and help them do literary analysis, but I'm doing things that they should have mastered in the 2nd grade.
Yeah.
And so I really push back, and I also offer support. I read a lot of research and I'm like, this is something that helps older kids. So in the meantime, teachers that have readers that are older and that are still struggling, here are some things that you can do in the meantime. But also, early reading teachers see the vertical alignment that's happening, or the disalignment, and understand like it doesn't go away, it just gets worse. It's the Matthew effect. The poor get poorer and the rich get richer, and that's what's happening.
All right. Well, look forward to speaking with you again, because I'm sure this conversation isn't going to stop here. And people are going to have opinions and comments that are probably going to flood the comment section of this video. And so, I look forward to continuing this conversation. I mean, it's near and dear to my heart, working in education and being somebody, who's black and from, Minneapolis public schools. And I hope that your work continues forward and we continue this conversation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.